"I promise to make you happy," he whispered during their honeymoon, and she, young and innocent, believed she had understood love, but she would soon discover that those words hid a devastating secret. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to find out what happened next. When Sophie awoke on that first morning as a wife, the scent of jasmine invaded the room through the linen curtains that danced in the ocean breeze of the Hamptons. Peter was still sleeping beside her, his dark hair scattered across the white pillow, and she allowed herself to smile as she remembered his whisper from the night before. "I promise to make you happy." The words resonated in her chest like a sacred chant, and for the first time in her 23 years, she felt she truly understood the meaning of love. The golden light of Southampton filtered through the shutters, casting geometric shadows on the aged hardwood floor of their honeymoon suite. Sophie silently slipped out of bed and approached the window. The ocean sparkled on the horizon, an infinite promise of adventures and discoveries. She touched the white gold wedding band that now adorned her finger, still incredulous at this destiny that had propelled her from her modest life in Boston to this world of privilege. "Already observing the world without me?" Peter's voice, still sleepy but tinged with affection, made her turn around. There he was, propped up on an elbow, his dark eyes reflecting a tenderness that made her heart flutter. At 42, Peter Davis possessed that quiet confidence of men who have navigated through life's storms. The few silver threads that dotted his black hair only added to his charm. "I couldn't believe all of this was real," she murmured, returning to the bed with a light step. Peter reached out to her, capturing her slender fingers in his palm. "It's only the beginning of our story, my Sophie." She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart racing like a schoolgirl's. "Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve all this happiness." Peter didn't answer immediately. A shadow passed fleetingly across his face, so brief that Sophie thought she had imagined it. Then he smiled, revealing those dimples she adored. "It's I who don't deserve you." Sophie couldn't know, as she leaned down to kiss him, how much those words contained a truth different from what she imagined. Like the horizon that seemed clear from their balcony, but hid unfathomable depths. The happiness she thought she was grasping was merely the surface of a much more complex reality. "Happiness is a bird with fragile wings," her grandmother used to say. "Don't hold it too tightly or it will escape you." But that morning, cradled by the illusion of perfect love, Sophie was far from imagining that these prophetic words would soon take on their full meaning. The honeymoon unfolded like an enchanted dream. 15 days of blue skies, hand-in-hand walks on the boardwalk, and candlelit dinners in restaurants overlooking the Atlantic. Sophie memorized every detail: the taste of the Napa Valley Cabernet that Peter chose with particular care, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he laughed, how his hand rested protectively on the small of her back when they entered a room. It was during their last evening in Southampton that the first crack appeared in this idyllic picture. "I need to make an important call," Peter announced in the middle of dinner, consulting his watch with a suddenly concerned expression. Sophie nodded, already accustomed to these mysterious business calls that sometimes interrupted their moments of intimacy. Peter excused himself and headed to the restaurant terrace, his phone pressed against his ear. From her seat, Sophie observed him. His back was turned to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand moved in jerky gestures. Something in this conversation seemed to deeply disturb him. When he returned, his face had composed itself back into a mask of serenity, but Sophie had learned from a childhood spent observing adults to detect emotions that simmered beneath appearances. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. "Of course," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just some details to sort out for our return." He took a sip of wine. "My mother has prepared the apartment in the west wing of the mansion. You'll see the view of the inner garden is magnificent." Sophie felt a slight unease invade her. "Your mother will be living with us." Peter gave a slight laugh, as if the question were naive. "The mansion has belonged to our family for 5 generations, darling. Elizabeth occupies the main wing, but we'll have our own space. You'll see it's immense." This detail, though crucial, had never been mentioned before. Sophie tried to control the wave of apprehension rising within her. She had imagined their life together in a modern apartment, perhaps in the Upper East Side, as Peter had vaguely mentioned, not in an ancestral home shared with her mother-in-law. "You seem surprised," observed Peter, his eyes scrutinizing her with new intensity. Sophie forced a smile. "A little, but I'm sure it will be wonderful." That night, as Peter slept deeply beside her, Sophie remained awake, contemplating the ornate ceiling. For the first time, she wondered if she really knew the man she had married. Their engagement had been so brief, barely 3 months after their meeting at an art exhibition in Boston, where Peter, on a business trip, had noticed her. Sometimes, the heart recognizes in an instant what the mind would take years to understand. He had told her to justify his rapid marriage proposal. And Sophie, raised on Jane Austen novels and Frost poems, had succumbed to this romantic vision of love at first sight. Her parents, strangely, had expressed no reservations about this rush. On the contrary, they had seemed relieved, almost eager to see her accept. A shiver ran through her body despite the warmth of the summer night. Questions she had never thought to ask began to insinuate themselves into her mind, like shadows lengthening at twilight. The arrival in New York was a whirlwind of new impressions. A car with a driver was waiting for them at the station, and Sophie was struck by the contrast between the sunny warmth of the Hamptons and the austere dignity of the city in this early autumn. Leaves were beginning to gild the trees in Central Park, and a fine rain was falling, enveloping the city in a greyish veil that gave it a melancholic air. The Davis mansion stood in the Upper East Side, majestic and intimidating with its 19th-century facade. A wrought-iron gate opened silently at their approach, revealing a cobbled courtyard where a marble fountain poured forth its crystalline water. "Welcome home," murmured Peter, squeezing her hand. Sophie had to summon all her will not to appear overwhelmed by the grandeur of the place. The massive doors opened onto a hall of imposing proportions, dominated by a marble staircase that rose in elegant curves to the upper floors. It was there that Elizabeth Davis appeared. Tall, slim, impeccably elegant despite her age. Sophie gave her 65 years. She stood at the top of the steps like a queen welcoming subjects. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight chignon that accentuated her high cheekbones and piercing gaze. "My son," she said simply, descending the steps. She kissed Peter on both cheeks, then turned to Sophie with a polite smile that didn't warm her grey eyes. "And my new daughter-in-law, I hope you will find your place among us." It wasn't exactly the warm welcome Sophie had prepared for. She extended her hand, which her mother-in-law briefly touched. "Thank you for welcoming me into your home, Mrs. Davis. It's magnificent. Elizabeth, please. After all, we are family now." The tone was cordial, but Sophie perceived an artificial note in this amiability. "Martha will show you to your apartments. I imagine you wish to refresh yourself after your journey. We'll dine at 8 o'clock sharp." Before Sophie could respond, a middle-aged woman in a grey uniform appeared, bowing slightly. "If Madam would follow me." Sophie cast a questioning glance at Peter, but he already seemed absorbed in a hushed conversation with his mother. With a slight sigh, she followed Martha through the maze of corridors leading to the West Wing. The apartments that Elizabeth had mentioned turned out to be a set of spacious but strangely impersonal rooms. The period furniture, though sumptuous, emanated a coldness that contrasted cruelly with the warmth of the small Boston apartment where Sophie had grown up. "Does Madame need anything else?" asked Martha, after explaining the lighting system and showing the adjoining bathroom. Sophie hesitated. "No." "Well, perhaps you could tell me how long you've worked for the Davis family." Martha seemed surprised by this question. 30 years, madam. I was here when Mr. Peter was just a child." "And what is life like here?" Sophie felt ridiculous as soon as the words left her mouth. Martha's face closed slightly. "Life is as it should be, madam. If you'll excuse me, I must prepare dinner." Left alone, Sophie approached the window. From there she could see the inner garden with its symmetrical paths and rose beds. Everything was perfectly maintained, with an almost clinical beauty. A half-open drawer in the secretary desk caught her attention. Inside, she discovered a small notebook bound in burgundy leather. Opening it, she found pages covered with elegant, precise handwriting. They were rules, dozens of rules governing daily life in the Davis house. Tide des Troisième, breakfast served in the dining room or upon request in the apartments. 12:30 p.m., lunch with family on Sundays and holidays only. 5 p.m., tea served in the small salon. 8 p.m., dinner, formal attire required. And it continued, detailing the behaviors expected during receptions, family traditions to be respected, down to the appropriate clothes for each occasion. Sophie closed the notebook, a shiver running down her spine. This was not simply a house she had integrated into, but a system, an institution with its codes and expectations. For a young woman who had always dreamed of freedom and adventures, these century-old walls began to feel more like a prison than a home. As she put the notebook away, she noticed an old photograph slipped between the pages. It showed a sad-eyed young woman dressed in a period gown. On the back, an inscription in faded ink, Eleanor Davis, 1920. Something in that melancholy gaze resonated with Sophie like a warning from the past. The following weeks were a balancing exercise for Sophie. Each day brought its lot of discoveries about the countless unwritten rules that governed life in the Davis mansion. She learned the hard way that the Blue Salon was reserved for visits from New York high society, while the library remained Elizabeth's exclusive domain. Each room, each object seemed to have its own history, its own protocol. Peter, for his part, revealed himself to be increasingly absent. Leaving early in the morning for business, he never discussed in detail. He often returned late, sometimes after she had fallen asleep. Their moments of intimacy became less frequent, replaced by a distant courtesy that resembled more a relationship between roommates than between spouses. One October morning, as golden leaves swirled in the garden, Sophie summoned her courage. "Peter, I'd like to understand exactly what your work consists of," she said as they breakfasted in the conservatory, the only moment of the day when they were truly alone. He looked up from his newspaper, surprised. "Investments, mainly." "Why do you ask?" "Because you're my husband, and I know almost nothing about your professional life." She tried to maintain a light tone, but a note of frustration seeped into her voice. Peter carefully folded his newspaper. "Business is complex at the moment. I prefer not to bore you with these details." "Bore me?" repeated Sophie, incredulous. "Peter, I studied economics. I'm not a child to be protected from the realities of the world." A shadow passed over Peter's face. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Elizabeth's entrance. "Good morning, my dears," she said with that smile that never reached her eyes. "Sophie, don't forget we have the charity committee this afternoon. I've taken the liberty of having the appropriate attire prepared. Martha will place it in your wardrobe." Sophie felt a wave of rebellion rise within her. "That's very kind, Elizabeth, but I had planned to visit the art gallery near MoMA today." An icy silence fell over the conservatory. Elizabeth stiffened imperceptibly, while Peter stared intently at his coffee cup. "The Davis family's social engagements are not optional, my dear," Elizabeth finally responded in a honeyed tone. "Your presence at the committee is expected." Sophie understood the implicit message. It wasn't a request, but an order. She glanced at Peter, hoping for support that didn't come. "Very well," she conceded with a forced smile. "I'll be delighted to attend." Elizabeth nodded, satisfied, before leaving the room in a rustle of silk. As soon as they were alone, Sophie turned to Peter. "You never say anything when she treats me like a doll to be dressed up and paraded around." Peter sighed deeply. "Sophie, my mother has certain expectations regarding our social position. These events are important for maintaining our network." "Our network or her network?" retorted Sophie. "I feel like I married an institution more than a man." A pained expression crossed Peter's face. He rose and approached her, taking her hands in his. "I know adjustment is difficult, but trust me, everything we do has a purpose." Sophie wanted to insist, to demand clearer answers, but something in Peter's gaze, a vulnerability she had never noticed before, made her hesitate. "Just don't shut me out of your life, Peter," she finally murmured. He kissed her forehead with a tenderness that momentarily rekindled the flame of their honeymoon. "Never. You're the most precious thing I have." These words should have reassured her, but as she went upstairs to prepare for that famous committee, Sophie couldn't help feeling that they sounded like lines learned in a play whose acts she didn't yet fully know. In her room, she found the outfit chosen by Elizabeth, a pearl grey suit of elegant sobriety but terribly conventional. Beside it, a case containing an emerald necklace. "A family jewel," specified the note left by her mother-in-law. Sophie touched the stones that sparkled with a deep, mysterious glow. Like everything in this house, This jewel seemed to carry the weight of a story that had not been told to her. Autumn gave way to a particularly harsh winter. New York wrapped itself in a mantle of snow that transformed the mansion's garden into a fairy tale landscape, frozen like the life that Sophie now led. 3 months after her marriage, she had learned to navigate the complex waters of the Davis family, adopting a facade of docility that masked a growing curiosity. Something didn't fit in this picture of perfect aristocratic family, and her observant mind began to gather clues. She noticed the phone calls Peter received late at night, the hushed conversations between him and Elizabeth that ceased as soon as she entered a room, the worried glances exchanged when mail arrived. One December day, while Peter was on a business trip to Chicago, and Elizabeth was attending a concert at Carnegie Hall, Sophie decided to explore the parts of the mansion that were tacitly forbidden to her. Peter's office, normally locked, had been left open, probably by Martha during cleaning. Sophie hesitated on the threshold, torn between respect for her husband's privacy and this growing need to understand what world she had really stepped into. Curiosity won out. The room was austere, dominated by a massive mahogany desk and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that no one seemed to ever read. Sophie approached the desk, noting the absence of personal objects. No photos, no mementos, only neatly stacked files. She gently opened the first drawer. Bills, bank statements. Nothing surprising until she noticed the letterheads. Late payment notices, reminders, threats of legal action. Her heart raced. The amounts were astronomical. The second drawer contained letters in handwriting she recognized as Elizabeth's, addressed to various personalities in the New York financial world. Requests for extensions, promises of repayment, discreet mentions of the forthcoming alliance with the Boston fortune. The Boston fortune. These words resonated strangely in Sophie's mind. Her family, though comfortable, was certainly not rich. Her father was a university professor, her mother a librarian. There was no fortune, except a memory surfaced, a conversation overheard by chance between her parents a few weeks before her meeting with Peter. Words caught on the fly concerning a reclusive great-uncle, Frank, living in a castle in Vermont, with no direct heirs. Her hands trembled as she continued her search. In the last drawer, under a false bottom that she discovered by accident, was a file marked Winter's Inheritance. Winters, her maiden name. The file contained detailed information on the considerable fortune of her great-uncle Frank, of which she was apparently the presumptive heir, property valuations, bank account estimates, and more disturbing still, correspondence between Peter and his lawyer, dating from before their meeting, discussing means of accessing this inheritance. Sophie's head was spinning. The puzzle pieces were assembling into an image she still refused to fully accept. The rush of the marriage, the insistence of her parents, the sudden interest of a man like Peter in an ordinary young woman from Boston. She hastily put the documents back in place when she heard the front door open. Voices echoed in the hall. Elizabeth had returned earlier than expected. Sophie left the office on tiptoe, her world silently crumbling around her. In her room, sitting on the edge of the bed she shared with a man who had perhaps married her solely for her inheritance, she suddenly felt terribly alone. That night, she cried for the first time since her marriage. Not tears of sadness, but of anger. Anger at Peter for his duplicity, at her parents for their possible complicity, but most of all at herself for having been so naive. By morning, however, something had changed in her. The romantic young girl who believed in fairy tales was beginning to fade, giving way to a woman determined to discover the whole truth, whatever the consequences. Snow was falling in lazy, thick flakes, transforming New York's rooftops into a succession of white domes. When Peter returned from Chicago 2 days later, Sophie had used this time to reflect, to calm the storm of emotions raging within her, and above all, to develop a strategy. She wouldn't accuse him directly. Not yet. She wanted first to observe, to confirm her suspicions, to understand the extent of what seemed to be a plot orchestrated around her. The evening of Peter's return, she greeted him with a smile she hoped was natural, playing the role of the loving wife with a perfection that surprised even herself. They dined in the grand dining room, in the company of Elizabeth, who directed the conversation toward the latest scandals of New York high society. Young Devereux has squandered the family fortune at the tables in Atlantic City, commented Elizabeth, delicately cutting her meat. His poor mother is forced to sell the estate in Connecticut. Peter nodded, visibly distracted. A tragedy for such an old lineage. Money slips so quickly through careless fingers, added Elizabeth with an oblique glance at Sophie. That's why rigorous management of a patrimony is essential. Sophie seized this unwittingly extended opportunity. Actually, I received a letter from my lawyer today, she lied with a calm that concealed the inner tumult. It seems my great-uncle Frank wishes to meet me. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Peter suspended his gesture, his wine-glass halfway to his lips, while Elizabeth froze, her fork in the air. "Frank Winters?" finally asked Peter, forcing himself to appear merely curious. "Yes," replied Sophie, carefully observing their reactions. "Apparently he's suddenly interested in me. It's strange, isn't it? I've never met him, and here he is wanting to make my acquaintance." Elizabeth put down her fork with deliberate slowness. "Elderly people often have whims. I wouldn't worry too much about it if I were you." "On the contrary," intervened Peter, shooting a warning glance at his mother. "Family ties are important. You should absolutely meet him, Sophie." Sophie's smile grew more assured. Their reaction confirmed her suspicions. "I was thinking of going next week. Alone, of course, an intimate meeting between relative and heir." She had deliberately used this last term to observe its effect. Peter visibly paled, while Elizabeth abruptly brought her napkin to her lips, as if to conceal her distress. "Heir?" repeated Peter with affected nonchalance. "You never mentioned an inheritance to me." Sophie took a sip of wine, savouring this moment of newly discovered power. "I was unaware of it myself until recently. Strangely, my parents never mentioned that I was the sole heir to a considerable fortune. Isn't that curious?" A quick exchange of glances between Peter and Elizabeth confirmed what she already knew. They were aware. They had always been. The rest of dinner unfolded in palpable tension, each maintaining the appearance of civilized conversation, while beneath the surface, the unspoken accumulated like the snow outside. Later that night, when Peter joined her in their bedroom, Sophie felt it was time for a more direct confrontation. "Why did you marry me, Peter?" she asked without preamble, sitting straight on the edge of the bed. He froze, his hand on the tie he was undoing. "What a question. Because I love you, of course." Sophie held his gaze. "Is that the only reason?" A silence settled between them, thick as the winter fog that enveloped New York. Peter finally sat heavily in an armchair near the window. "What are you trying to make me say, Sophie?" "The truth, for once." He passed a weary hand over his face, suddenly older, more vulnerable. "The truth is rarely simple." "Try anyway," she insisted, surprised by her own firmness. Peter remained silent for so long that Sophie thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a breath, "The Davis family is no longer what it was. Appearances are just that. Appearances." "You're ruined," stated Sophie, finally putting words to what she had discovered. Peter flinched as if she had slapped him, but didn't deny it. "My father's investments failed. Debts accumulated. We maintain a facade, but—" "And you needed an heiress to replenish the coffers," completed Sophie, her throat tight. "That's why my parents were so enthusiastic about this marriage. They knew. Your parents wanted to secure a social position for you that their modest situation couldn't offer," replied Peter, with a new sincerity in his voice. And you needed my inheritance," concluded Sophie, a solitary tear rolling down her cheek. Peter rose and came to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. His eyes shone with an emotion that Sophie couldn't decipher. Remorse, shame, or perhaps a mixture of both. "At the beginning, perhaps," he finally admitted. "But Sophie, I truly fell in love with you. Your kindness, your intelligence, your way of seeing the world. You've illuminated my life in a way I never imagined." Sophie withdrew her hands from his, unable to disentangle truth from lies in this confession. "How can I believe you now? How can I know if each 'I love you' wasn't calculated to access this inheritance?" A heavy silence settled between them. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving New York in a supernatural calm as if suspended in time. "I can't give you proof," Peter finally said. "I can only ask you to give me a chance to show you that my feelings are real, beyond the circumstances that brought us together." Sophie rose, creating a physical distance that reflected the emotional abyss that had just opened between them. I need time to reflect on all this, to decide what I want to do. Peter nodded slowly, defeat inscribed in every line of his face. I understand. That night, Sophie slept in one of the guest rooms, surrounded by the faded luxury of a family in decline. As she stared at the ceiling adorned with ancient moldings, she realized that her entire life as a wife had been built on a house of cards that had just collapsed. But amid the ruins, an unexpected thought emerged. For the first time since her marriage, she felt strangely free. Free to see the truth, free to make her own choices. The discovery that should have destroyed her paradoxically gave her a power she had never possessed. The days that followed were strange, as if suspended outside of time. Sophie continued to play her role in the Davis family's social theater, attending dinners, displaying smiles of circumstance, but now observing everything with a new, more lucid gaze. She noticed the signs she had ignored before, antiques discreetly disappearing from display cases, replaced by convincing copies, bills slipped under piles of mail, furtive visits from men in dark suits who conversed with Peter in hushed tones. Sophie and Peter maintained a distant courtesy, like two actors aware that the play was ending, but obliged to continue reciting their lines. He didn't try to make her return to their shared room, respecting her need for space. Elizabeth, for her part, redoubled her attentions as if fearing Sophie would fly away with the coveted inheritance. "My dear, I thought we could visit this exhibition at the Met together, or I had that Boston dish you love so much prepared." These clumsy attempts at rapprochement inspired in Sophie only pity tinged with bitterness. One January morning, as frost transformed the garden trees into crystal sculptures, a letter arrived. Sophie recognized it immediately by the elegant handwriting and the wax seal. It came from her great-uncle Frank, whom she had indeed contacted through his attorney after her discoveries. She opened it in the solitude of her room, her hands slightly trembling. "My dear grandniece, your letter has brought me more joy than you could imagine. After so many years of solitude in this old Vermont estate, discovering that a young woman of our blood is finally interested in me warms my tired heart. I have followed your life from afar, never daring to intervene. Your marriage to young Davis first worried me. I know too well the financial difficulties of this once prestigious family. But if you have found love, who am I to judge? Know, however, that you always have a place here, should you ever need it. My door is open to you, and with it all that I possess. For what good is a fortune with no one to bequeath it to? Your old uncle, who hopes to meet you soon. Frank." Sophie set down the letter, moved by the sincerity that emanated from these lines. Frank Winters appeared to be a sensitive man, far from the image of the eccentric old man that Elizabeth had tried to portray. This letter was also a confirmation. She was indeed the heir to a considerable fortune, significant enough to have motivated this whole marriage charade. That evening, as she prepared for yet another society dinner organized by Elizabeth, Sophie made her decision. She would no longer be a pawn in this social chess game. It was time to take control of her life. She descended the majestic staircase, dressed in a simple black dress, elegant but devoid of the jewels and frills that Elizabeth considered essential. In the grand salon, guests were already gathered, champagne flutes in hand, artificial laughter resonating under crystal chandeliers. Peter immediately came to meet her, a tense smile on his lips. "You look beautiful tonight." "Thank you," she replied simply. "Could we speak privately after dinner?" A glimmer of hope crossed his gaze. "Of course, in the library." Sophie nodded, then slipped among the guests, playing one last time her role of perfect hostess while observing this world that had nearly engulfed her. Men and women, prisoners of appearances, wearing masks for so long they had forgotten their true faces. Dinner seemed interminable, each course following the previous in a culinary ballet perfectly orchestrated by Elizabeth. Sophie ate little, her mind entirely focused on the conversation to come. Finally, as guests dispersed into the various salons for digestives, Sophie discreetly slipped toward the library. Peter joined her a few minutes later, gently closing the heavy door behind him. "You've made your decision, haven't you?" he asked directly, his face partially in the shadow of the dimmed lamps. Sophie nodded, appreciating his perspicacity. "I'm leaving, Peter." He took the blow, his body imperceptibly stiffening. "I understand. I don't think you do," she replied softly. "I'm not leaving out of anger or vengeance. I'm leaving because I realize we married for the wrong reasons. You for my potential inheritance, me for a romantic fairy tale that existed only in my imagination." Peter approached the window, contemplating the garden asleep under the snow. "You're right, of course. I was a coward not to tell you the truth from the beginning." He turned to her, his face now fully lit, revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. "But my feelings for you became real, Sophie, more real than anything I've known." She felt her resolution falter for a moment in the face of the obvious sincerity of these words. "Perhaps, but our marriage was born of a lie, and I cannot build my future on that foundation." "What will you do?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "I will visit my great-uncle Frank. Get to know him, understand my heritage, not the money, but who I really am." She paused, searching for words. "Then I'll find a place of my own, a space where I can discover what I want to do with my life, without others' expectations." Peter nodded slowly. "You deserve that freedom." He hesitated before adding, "I won't ask for anything from your inheritance. I'll find another way to solve our financial problems." This promise, which she had not solicited, touched Sophie more than she would have thought possible. "Thank you." A silence settled between them, no longer tense as in recent days, but tinged with a shared melancholy for what might have been. "When will you leave?" Peter finally asked. "Tomorrow." The decision had been made when writing to Frank, but speaking it aloud suddenly made it very real. Peter approached her, stopping at a respectful distance. "I deprived you of choices by hiding the truth. I won't make the same mistake by trying to hold you back." He extended his hand, lightly brushing her cheek. "But know that if one day you wanted to return, not as a solution to our problems, but as the extraordinary woman you are, the door will always be open." Sophie felt tears come to her eyes, surprised by this unexpected emotion. In this moment of absolute truth, she glimpsed the man Peter could have been, freed from the chains of his heritage and family expectations. "Goodbye, Peter," she whispered, turning away before her resolve weakened. As she left the library, a strange lightness invaded her. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter of her life, a chapter she would write herself, page after page, without worrying about conventions or expectations. For the first time since her marriage, Sophie smiled, a genuine smile coming from the depths of her being. The truth, however painful, had finally set her free. The train sped through the snow-covered plains of the eastern seaboard, leaving behind New York and its complex memories. Seated by the window, Sophie watched the landscape gradually transform, the plains giving way to hills, then to mountains that heralded Vermont. The departure had been calm, almost dignified. Elizabeth, though visibly upset, had not tried to hold her back, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps because she understood that the game was lost. Peter had accompanied her to the station, carrying her suitcase in silence, offering a final kiss on her forehead before the doors closed. Now alone with her thoughts, Sophie oscillated between excitement for the unknown and an unexpected melancholy. Despite the deception that had surrounded her marriage, she couldn't help wondering if she wasn't too easily abandoning something that could have been saved, transformed. "Sometimes you need to step away from the painting to better see it as a whole," her art professor in Boston had told her years ago. These words resonated with her as the train traversed the Hudson Valley. Her great-uncle's estate stood atop a hill, overlooking the village of Woodstock, a golden stone building with lavender shutters surrounded by century-old pines. Frank Winters awaited her on the porch, tall and lean despite his 85 years, his face weathered by sun and years, but his eyes a vivid blue that resembled Sophie's. Their meeting was touching in its simplicity. No exaggerated effusions or stiff formalities, just the silent recognition of a family bond, too long ignored. "Here you are at last," he said simply, taking her hands. "I feel like I'm seeing your grandmother when she was your age." The following days were a mutual discovery. Frank, contrary to the image of the eccentric old man Elizabeth had suggested, revealed himself to be a cultured man, with a sharp mind and subtle humor. A former diplomat, he had traveled the world before retiring to this corner of Vermont, where he indulged his passion for painting, a talent that Sophie discovered with surprise she shared with him. "Art is in our blood," he explained one afternoon as they painted together on the terrace overlooking the maple groves. Your grandmother had this gift too, but in her time a woman of good family didn't pursue a career in the arts. Sophie absorbed these family stories like a sponge, filling the gaps of a past her parents never spoke about. Frank, for his part, seemed to grow younger through contact with her youth and curiosity. One evening, after dinner shared in the grand dining room where a fire crackled in the hearth, Frank broached the subject that had been floating between them since her arrival. You must wonder why I designated you as my heir. Sophie blushed slightly. The question has crossed my mind. Frank smiled, his face creasing into a constellation of wrinkles. I never had children. My diplomatic career took me from one country to another, one mission to another, never leaving me time to start a family. He swirled the wine in his glass, contemplating its ruby color in the firelight. When I finally retired, I was too old, too accustomed to my solitude. He fixed his penetrating gaze on Sophie. I followed from afar the lives of my nephews and nieces, then their children. Most proved to be people interested only in money and prestige. He gently shook his head. Not you. You didn't even know me, Sophie softly protested. Don't be so sure. I have my sources. His eyes twinkled with mischief. I know you turned down the lucrative position your father arranged for you to work in that small art gallery in Boston. I know you spent your summers teaching painting to underprivileged children. I know you read Proust and Virginia Woolf, not merely for appearance, but because you find a resonance with your soul. Sophie was stunned. How? A lonely old man has much time to observe the world, he replied with a shrug. I engaged discreet people to keep me informed. Not to spy on you, he quickly added, seeing her expression, but to reassure myself that my inheritance wouldn't be wasted. He leaned forward, his face suddenly serious. Sophie, my fortune is considerable. Properties, investments, artworks. I wanted it to go to someone who would see it not as a means to buy prestige, but as a tool to create something meaningful. Sophie felt the weight of this responsibility descend upon her. I'm not sure I'm equal to such expectations. Frank shook his head. I have no specific expectations. I simply want you to use this inheritance to become fully yourself, to realize your dreams, whatever they may be. He took a sip of wine before adding, and if you decide to spend it all on chocolate and travels around the world, well, that will be your prerogative. This remark lightened the atmosphere, drawing a laugh from Sophie. But deep within herself, Frank's words had touched a sensitive chord. All her life she had lived according to others' expectations, her parents, then Peter and Elizabeth. Never had she truly reflected on what she wanted for herself. That night, unable to sleep, Sophie went out onto the terrace despite the cold. The moon illuminated the maple groves with a silvery light, and in the distance, the village lights twinkled like stars fallen from the sky. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream without constraints, without worrying about conventions or obligations. What would she do if she were completely free? The answer came more easily than she would have thought. She would paint, travel to capture the light of different corners of the world, perhaps open a gallery where unknown artists could exhibit. But one image persisted, insinuating itself into her thoughts despite her efforts to push it away. That of Peter, standing on the station platform, his face reflecting a mixture of regret and resignation as the train pulled away. She wondered what he was doing at this moment, if life in the mansion had resumed its course, if Elizabeth had already begun to seek a new heiress for her son. Sophie shook her head, chasing away these thoughts. She had come here to find herself, not to wallow in a marriage that never had solid foundations. Yet as she returned to her room, warmed by a light breeze that announced the coming spring, she couldn't help wondering if the truth, now that it was exposed, couldn't serve as more solid foundation than an elaborate lie. February in Vermont brought days where the sun, still timid, gradually warmed the earth. Sophie had settled into a peaceful routine alongside Frank, sharing their mornings painting in the bright studio on the top floor of the estate, then lunching on the terrace when weather permitted. Under her great-uncle's benevolent tutelage, her artistic talent blossomed. Frank, whose canvases had been exhibited in New York galleries under a pseudonym, to prevent my diplomatic status from influencing critics, he explained, taught her techniques she had never learned during her courses in Boston. You have an eye for light, he observed one day. examining her canvas depicting a maple grove at dusk. It's a rare gift. Many technical painters never manage to capture this ethereal quality. These compliments, coming from a man whose judgment wasn't influenced by family obligations, nourished Sophie's confidence in her art. For the first time, she began to see herself not as an amateur indulging in a hobby, but as a true artist in the making. One morning, as they took coffee in the library, Frank handed her an envelope. "I've taken the liberty of arranging something for you." Sophie opened it with curiosity. Inside was an invitation for a month-long artistic residency in New York, in a loft belonging to an old friend of Frank's. "It's extraordinary," she stammered, scanning the details of the program that included sessions with renowned American masters. "You need to explore, to be exposed to other influences," explained Frank. "Vermont is magnificent, but New York is the soul of modern art. The light is different, the very air seems impregnated with artistic history." Sophie hesitated, touched by this opportunity, but reluctant at the idea of leaving her great-uncle alone. "But you—" Frank waved away her concerns with a hand gesture. "I'm not on my deathbed yet, my child. I've lived alone for decades. I'll survive a month without your company." His gaze grew more serious. "Don't make the mistake I made, Sophie. Don't let opportunities pass by out of fear or misplaced duty." These words resonated deeply with her. Wasn't this exactly what she had done all her life, sacrificing her desires on the altar of obligations and expectations? "I'll go," she decided, a new determination in her voice. Preparations for New York occupied the following days. Sophie was surprised to anticipate this adventure with an excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. Yet amid this effervescence, thoughts of New York and the life she had left there sometimes emerged, unexpected and troubling. One evening, as she sorted her brushes to decide which to take, Frank entered her room with a letter in hand. "This just arrived for you." Sophie immediately recognized the elegant, measured handwriting. "Peter." Her heart leaped in a way she hadn't anticipated. "You don't have to read it now," Frank said softly, perceiving her distress. "Or ever." "No, it's all right," assured Sophie, taking the envelope. "Thank you." Once alone, she contemplated the letter at length before deciding to open it. Peter's words were simple, direct, devoid of the flourishes and dissimulations that had marked their relationship. "Sophie, I hope this letter finds you well and that Vermont brings you the peace you deserve. I'm not writing to ask you to return or to justify myself. I simply wanted you to know that your departure has prompted changes I would never have had the courage to initiate otherwise. I've sold the mansion, not to an anonymous buyer, but to a foundation that will transform it into a cultural center open to the public. Elizabeth has moved into a more modest apartment, a difficult transition for her, but necessary. As for me, I've accepted a teaching position at the New York Academy of Art. The salary is modest compared to my past ambitions, but for the first time I feel useful, authentic. I owe you apologies that words cannot fully express, not only for marrying you under false pretenses, but for almost stifling the extraordinary person you are. I wish you to find your path whatever it may be. If our roads should cross again one day, I hope it will be as two authentic people, freed from the chains of the past and expectations. With sincerity, Peter. Sophie folded the letter, surprised by the emotion that gripped her. She had expected to feel anger, bitterness, perhaps even a vindictive satisfaction at the idea that Peter was facing the consequences of his actions. Instead, she felt a strange compassion, mixed with an unexpected respect for this man, who seemed to finally be finding his own path, away from the family expectations that had imprisoned him. That night, sitting on her windowsill, contemplating the moon bathing the maple groves in silver light, Sophie reflected on the complex nature of human relationships. How could one simultaneously feel betrayed by someone and sincerely wish them happiness? How to reconcile the pain of the past with the possibility of a future where this same person might play a different role? She had no answers to these questions, but for the first time she accepted this uncertainty without anxiety. Life wasn't a painting with neat, defined contours, but rather a watercolor where colors merged into one another, creating unexpected nuances. With this new perspective, Sophie turned toward New York and the adventure that awaited her there, her heart open to the infinite possibilities now offered by her reclaimed freedom. New York opened to Sophie like a living art book. From her arrival, the city enveloped her in its unique atmosphere, a blend of modernity and artistic energy. The loft where the artistic residency took place, perched in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn with a view of the Manhattan skyline, was a haven of shared creativity. 12 artists from around the world were staying there, each with their own style, history, and vision. Among them, Sophie at first felt intimidated. She, the self-taught painter who painted for pleasure, faced with creators who had studied at the most prestigious art schools, exhibited in renowned galleries. "We are all apprentices in the face of the world's beauty," Elena, a Venezuelan painter with silver hair, told her when Sophie expressed her doubts. "The only real difference is in the gaze, in the honesty with which we translate what we see." These words resonated deeply with Sophie. Honesty, this quality she had so sought in her personal life, was also becoming the foundation of her artistic expression. Days flowed in a rhythm, both intense and liberating. Mornings, classes with American masters who generously shared their knowledge. Afternoons, explorations in the city, sketchbook in hand, capturing an angle of light on the Brooklyn Bridge, the profile of an old man in Washington Square, the play of shadow and clarity under the High Line. Evenings, the residents gathered around long tables in the loft's common space, sharing meals accompanied by local wine, passionately discussing art, politics, philosophy. Those conversations that nourish the soul as much as the body. For Sophie, each day was a rebirth. Far from the social constraints of Upper East Side, from the family expectations of Boston, she discovered a creative freedom she had never known. Her style evolved, breaking free from the academic techniques she had striven to master to please her professors, embracing a more instinctive, more personal approach. "You paint as if you had finally removed a veil from your eyes," observed James, the director of the residency, examining one of her new canvases depicting a Brooklyn street bathed in the golden light of evening. "There's an authenticity in your work that didn't exist when you arrived." This observation touched Sophie more deeply than technical praise. Authenticity, wasn't it exactly what she sought in all aspects of her life? One morning, as she painted on the loft's terrace, capturing the mist rising gently from the East River, James approached with an unexpected proposal. "We're organizing a collective exhibition at the end of the residency," he announced, "in a small gallery near Chelsea. I'd like you to present 3 canvases." Sophie felt her heart accelerate. A real exhibition, in a city where art flowed through the very veins of the concrete. I don't know if I'm ready." James smiled, his eyes narrowed from years of scrutinizing beauty in all its forms. "No one is ever truly ready to unveil their soul to the world, but that's precisely why it must be done." This conversation marked a turning point. Sophie began to work with a new intensity, losing track of time before her easel, sometimes until the first light of dawn. She no longer sought to create something beautiful or technically perfect. She strove to translate onto canvas the truth of her experience, the complexity of her emotions. Her series emerged almost organically, 3 canvases representing windows. The first, a window of the New York mansion viewed from inside, framing an impeccably maintained but frozen garden, the colors cold and controlled. The second, a window of the Vermont estate, ajar onto a landscape of hills and maples, the light beginning to warm the composition. The third, a New York loft window wide open, overflowing with flowers, with a vertiginous view of the city and its infinite possibilities, the colors vibrant and free. She simply titled the series Awakening. The eve of the exhibition, Sophie received a call from Frank. His warm voice, slightly muffled by distance, made her realize how much she missed him. "James sent me photos of your work," he announced without preamble. "It's extraordinary, Sophie, well beyond what I could have hoped." "You're exaggerating," she protested, but the pride in her voice betrayed her pleasure. "Not at all. You've found your voice, your language." He paused. "I'm sorry I can't be there tomorrow." "It doesn't matter," she reassured him. "You'll be there in spirit." "Actually," Frank resumed with a note of mischief in his voice, "I've taken the liberty of sending invitations to some people who might be interested in your work. Gallerists, collectors." "Frank," exclaimed Sophie, divided between excitement and apprehension. "You shouldn't have—" "Don't worry," he gently interrupted. "I didn't mention our family connection. They'll come for your talent, not to please a fortunate old man. This reassurance touched her. Frank understood her need to be recognized for herself, not for her name or connections. "There's another thing," he added after a moment of hesitation. "I also sent an invitation to Peter." Sophie felt her heart skip a beat. "Peter? Why?" "Because he asked about you. Because he seems to be sincerely transforming himself." Frank sighed. "And also perhaps because an old man like me believes that some stories deserve a second chance, when foundations have been rebuilt with honesty." Sophie remained silent, absorbing these words and the contradictory emotions they stirred in her. "You're not obligated to anything," Frank quickly added. "If he comes, it will simply be as a visitor among others. The decision to speak to him or not is entirely yours." After hanging up, Sophie went out onto the balcony of her room. New York spread before her, magnificent and mysterious in the twilight light. Somewhere in this city, visitors were perhaps preparing for tomorrow's exhibition, and among them, perhaps, a man she had both loved and fled from. The prospect of seeing Peter again awakened complex feelings in her, not the anger or resentment she might have expected, but an almost serene curiosity. Who had this man become, freed from his mother's expectations and the constraints of his milieu? And who had she become? This Sophie who was no longer afraid to show the world her art and through it her soul. Tomorrow would bring its answers. For now she was content to contemplate the stars beginning to dot the New York sky, aware that whatever the outcome of this exhibition, she had already won the most important victory, that of having found herself. The gallery near Chelsea was an intimate space with white walls and ancient hardwood floors, perfectly enhanced by carefully studied lighting. The works of the 12 residents were exhibited, each with its own space, creating a fascinating visual dialogue between different artistic sensibilities. Sophie, dressed in a simple midnight blue dress that contrasted with her fair skin, stood near her 3 canvases, welcoming visitors with a mixture of apprehension and pride. Reactions to her Awakening series were enthusiastic. Several people had lingered before her windows, captivated by the emotional evolution they narrated. "It's a metaphor for personal liberation, isn't it?" asked a middle-aged woman with a strong southern accent. "One can almost physically feel the expansion of consciousness, from painting to painting." Sophie smiled, touched by this reading so true to her intention. "Exactly. It's a journey toward authenticity." The evening progressed, wine flowed, conversations animated. Sophie noticed several of the contacts Frank had mentioned. She recognized them from business cards discreetly slipped into her hand after technical discussions of her work. One of them, a New York gallerist named Claire, even proposed a solo exhibition for the following autumn. "Your work has something rare," she explained, "an emotional honesty that transcends technique. Collectors seek this more than formal perfection." As Sophie discussed the practical details of this unexpected opportunity with Claire, she saw him. Peter stood at the gallery entrance, elegant in a dark suit that contrasted with the artistic casualness of most visitors. He observed the crowd, visibly looking for someone. For her, she realized with a shiver of anticipation. Their gazes met across the crowded room, a moment of recognition, of silent connection. Peter made no gesture to approach immediately, leaving her space and choice. This restraint, so different from the man who had orchestrated their meeting and marriage, touched Sophie more than she would have thought possible. She excused herself to Claire and slowly crossed the gallery, her heart beating an odd rhythm, neither entirely the excitement of love nor entirely the apprehension of confrontation, but something new, indefinable. "Good evening, Peter," she said simply as she reached him. "Sophie." His voice was the same, but something in his gaze had changed, a vulnerability, an authenticity that hadn't been there before. "Your works are remarkable. Thank you for coming." She was surprised by the sincerity in her own words. "It's unexpected." A slight smile touched his lips. "Frank can be very persuasive when he sets his mind to it." "Did he tell you that we're related?" she asked, curious. "Not exactly, but I guessed." Peter contemplated the room before returning his attention to her. "Could we talk for a moment, perhaps outside?" Sophie hesitated briefly, then nodded. "There's a small courtyard behind the gallery." They stepped into the New York night, sweet and jasmine-scented. Lanterns hanging from trees cast a soft light on the ancient stone pavers of the courtyard. They sat on a stone bench, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "I didn't come to disrupt your new life," began Peter, looking straight ahead. "I simply wanted to see with my own eyes that you were well, that you had found your path." Sophie observed him, noting the small changes. A few more silver threads in his hair, more pronounced lines at the corners of his eyes, but also a kind of new serenity in his bearing. "I am well," she confirmed softly. "Better than well, in fact." She paused, searching for words. "Your letter, it touched me. These changes in your life seem significant." Peter nodded slowly. "They are. Selling the mansion was liberating, like shedding an overly heavy suit I'd been wearing forever." He gave a small, joyless laugh. "My mother doesn't speak to me much, of course, but that's a price I'm willing to pay to finally live on my own terms." "Teaching suits you?" she asked, genuinely interested. Peter's face suddenly animated. "More than I could have imagined. The students are brilliant, provocative. They push me to question all my preconceived ideas about art." He shook his head in wonder. "It's ironic, isn't it? I spent my life pursuing prestige and financial security, only to finally discover happiness in a modest job I would once have considered beneath my station." This disarming confession touched Sophie. She recognized in his journey an echo of her own transformation. "I understand," she said softly. "I too have discovered that what I was seeking was the opposite of what I had been taught to value." A comfortable silence settled between them, inhabited by cricket song and the distant sounds of the city. "I won't ask you to forgive me," Peter finally resumed, turning his gaze to her. "What I did, marrying you for your potential inheritance, was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that meeting you, despite the circumstances, changed my life. Not as I had planned, but in a much deeper way." Sophie felt an unexpected emotion rise within her. "Life is strange, isn't it? Without this deception, I might never have found the courage to free myself, to discover who I truly am." She smiled with gentle irony. "In a way, I owe you a form of gratitude." Peter looked at her with surprise, then burst into sincere laughter that reminded Sophie why she had been attracted to him in the first place. "That's a very generous way of seeing things." "It's not generosity," she corrected. "It's just an acknowledgement of life's complexity. Terrible things can lead to wonderful discoveries. Lies can, paradoxically, lead us to a deeper truth." Their gazes met, and Sophie saw in him not the man who had deceived her, nor the husband she had left, but a human being in evolution, imperfect and authentic. This new perception freed her from the last residues of anger she might have harbored. "Sophie," said Peter, his face suddenly serious, "I didn't come with expectations or demands, but now that I see you, that I talk with you—" He hesitated, searching for words with an unusual caution for him. "Would it be possible someday for us to know each other anew? Not as husband and wife, but as two people starting from scratch, with honesty this time?" The question floated between them, heavy with possibilities. Sophie took her time to answer, listening not only to her mind, but also to the subtler whispers of her heart. "I can't give you a definitive answer tonight," she finally said. "My life is in full transformation. I'm still discovering who I am, what I want." She looked him straight in the eyes. "But I can accept that we stay in contact, that we see where life leads us, without rush or expectations." The relief and gratitude that illuminated Peter's face showed Sophie that he understood the value of what she was offering. Not a promise, but a possibility. A door neither closed nor wide open, but ajar onto an uncertain future. They returned together to the gallery, where the exhibition was in full swing. Before rejoining the other guests, Peter turned to her one last time. "Whatever the outcome," he said simply, "thank you for granting me this moment." Sophie nodded, moved by the sincerity of these words. Then she headed toward her paintings, where a new group of visitors awaited the artist to discuss those enigmatic windows that progressively opened onto the world. After the effervescence of New York, Vermont welcomed Sophie back into its soothing silence. The pines stood out against a sky of limpid blue, and Frank's estate, with its stones gilded by centuries of sun, seemed to await her like an old friend. Frank embraced her at length on the porch, his eyes shining with undisguised pride. "My little recognized artist," he murmured with affection. "Tell me everything." The following days were dedicated to stories. Sophie told him about the other residents, the techniques learned, the museums visited, and of course the exhibition that had been a real success. 3 of her works had been sold, not those from the Awakening series, which she considered too personal to part with, and several exhibition proposals had been made to her. Frank listened to everything with an attention that never flagged, asking pertinent questions, visibly savoring this artistic renaissance as if it were his own. It was only on the 3rd evening, as they dined on the terrace under a star-studded sky, that Sophie finally broached the subject they had both carefully avoided. "Peter was at the exhibition," she said simply, observing Frank's reaction. The old man nodded slowly. "I know. He called to thank me for the invitation." He raised a scrutinizing gaze to her. "How was your meeting?" Sophie took time to formulate her response, absently turning the stem of her wineglass between her fingers. "Better than I would have imagined. He's changed." "People can change, Sophie," Frank said softly. "Not their deep nature, perhaps, but their consciousness, their priorities, their way of being in the world. I'm living proof of that." Sophie raised a questioning eyebrow. "Oh, I was an ambitious and manipulative diplomat for decades," he explained with a small laugh. "Putting political interests before human considerations, sacrificing authenticity on the altar of career." He shook his head with a mixture of regret and self-deprecation. "It took me reaching my 60s to realize the emptiness of that existence." This unexpected confession created a new bond between them. Sophie had never considered that her great-uncle, with his quiet wisdom and evident integrity, might have known his own moral struggles, his own transformations. "Do you think Peter is sincere in his desire to change?" she asked, suddenly vulnerable. Frank took his time to answer, visibly weighing his words. "I believe him capable of sincerity, yes, but that's not the most important question." "What is it then?" "The question is knowing what you truly want." Frank leaned slightly forward. "Sophie, in these last months, you've discovered your own voice, your own path. The decision to let Peter play a role in it, or not, must come from what you desire for your future, not from his redemption." These words resonated deeply with her. For so long, she had let the desires and needs of others dictate her life. Even her decision to leave Peter had been, in a way, a reaction to his deception rather than a choice affirming her own vision. "I don't yet know what I want," she finally admitted, "but for the first time, I feel that it's my decision. Not what's expected of me, not what will accommodate others, but mine." Frank smiled, visibly moved. "That's perhaps the most important thing I've ever heard come out of your mouth." Spring was fully settling in Vermont, transforming the hills into impressionist paintings of tender greens and bright yellows. Sophie spent her mornings painting, inspired by this nature in Renaissance that echoed her own transformation. In the afternoons, she explored the surroundings, sometimes by car, often on foot, discovering perched villages, colorful markets, secluded chapels amid maple groves not yet in full bloom. These solitary explorations allowed her to reflect on her future. The offer of exhibition in New York for autumn was tempting, but was she ready to return to that city charged with complex memories? And if she did return, would it be keeping a prudent distance from Peter, or exploring this possibility of a new beginning he had evoked in New York? One evening, as she returned from one of her excursions, Frank welcomed her with an unusually serious expression. "I've received news from New York," he announced, inviting her to sit in the salon. "Peter has had an accident. Nothing serious," he quickly added upon seeing concern cross Sophie's face. "A fall while cycling, a few cracked ribs, but he's hospitalized for a few days." Sophie felt a wave of contradictory emotions pass through her. Concern, certainly, but also a sudden awareness of the attachment she continued to feel despite everything. "I should perhaps," she began, without knowing exactly how to finish this sentence. Frank observed her carefully. "You should do what your heart dictates, Sophie. Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but out of conscious choice." That night, lying in her bed, Sophie contemplated the ceiling, listening to the cricket song rising from the garden. Frank's words resonated in her like a mantra. Out of conscious choice, not out of duty. What did she truly want? The simplest and yet most complex question she had ever asked herself. She wanted to paint, to explore her artistic talent without others' judgments or expectations. She wanted to travel, to discover other lights, other landscapes to capture on her canvases. She wanted to feel free, mistress of her decisions. But did she also want to give a second chance to this relationship with Peter? Not to pick up where they had left off. That would be impossible and undesirable. But perhaps to build something new, founded on truth this time. By dawn, her decision was made. She would make the journey to New York, not out of obligation, but to see with her own eyes, to feel with her own heart if this possibility deserved to be explored. "I'm leaving for a few days," she announced to Frank at breakfast. "I need to clarify some things." The old man smiled with infinite tenderness. "I know. And whatever decision you make, remember that this estate will always be your refuge if you need it." Sophie embraced him, moved by this unconditional affection she had never truly known before. "Thank you for showing me what family truly means." A few hours later, she boarded the train to New York, her sketchbook on her knees and a new certainty in her heart. Whatever the future, it would henceforth be shaped by her own choices, not by others' expectations or manipulations. The landscape flashed by outside the window, fields, villages, forests, and Sophie found herself looking at them with a painter's eye, noting the variations of light, the contrasts, the natural compositions offering themselves to her. The world had become an infinite canvas of possibilities, waiting for her to apply her own colors. New York welcomed Sophie beneath an April sky that alternated between spring showers and bright clearings, giving the city a particular glow. Leaving Grand Central, she was struck by the familiarity of the places. The same streets, the same monuments, but her gaze upon them had profoundly changed. She had reserved a room in a small hotel in Greenwich Village, far from the Upper East Side, and memories of the Davis mansion. This deliberate choice symbolized her willingness to approach this visit as a new beginning, not as a return to the past. Her first day was devoted to practical matters. She met with Claire, the gallerist who had proposed an autumn exhibition, to discuss concrete details. The venue was charming, an intimate but reputed gallery in Soho, with white walls bathed in natural light. "I've thought of a title for the exhibition," Sophie proposed as they shared coffee. "Metamorphoses." Claire smiled, visibly seduced by the idea. "Perfect. Simple, evocative, and so apt for your work." She observed Sophie with curiosity. "You seem different from the young woman I met in Chelsea, more assured." Sophie nodded, aware of this inner transformation that now reflected in her outward demeanor. "I'm learning to trust my vision, in art as in life." It was only the next day that she decided to contact Peter. A simple message on her phone. "I'm in New York for a few days. If you're feeling well enough, I'd like to see you." The response came almost immediately. "I'm being discharged from the hospital this afternoon. Could we meet tomorrow in Central Park, near the Bethesda Fountain, 3 p.m.? Sophie smiled at this proposal. Central Park, a public place, neutral, far from the memories of their life together. Peter understood the importance of this new symbolic territory. The day preceding their meeting, Sophie spent walking through New York, rediscovering the city through her artist's eyes. She stopped at length on the Brooklyn Bridge, sketching the changing reflections of the East River. She wandered through galleries in Chelsea, drawing inspiration from contemporary works exhibited. She lunched alone at a café terrace near Washington Square, observing the ballet of passers-by. This chosen solitude bore no resemblance to the imposed solitude she had felt in the Davis mansion. It was a space of freedom, of reflection, of connection with herself. The next day, at 3 o'clock sharp, she entered Central Park. Spring had transformed the park into a symphony of tender greens and early blossoms. Children were sailing miniature boats on the fountain, their laughter carried by the light breeze. Peter was already there, seated on a bench, an open book on his knees. Seeing her, he stood with a slight grimace that betrayed his still painful ribs. "Sophie," he said simply, his face lighting up with a sincere smile. She was struck by his appearance, more casual than she had ever seen him, dressed in simple jeans and a blue shirt, his hair slightly longer than before, but it was above all his gaze that had changed, more open, more present. "Hello, Peter." She gestured toward his torso. "How are you feeling?" "Better." He gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "That's what happens when you try to recapture your youth by cycling after 20 years of abstinence." This self-deprecation, this new ability to make fun of himself, touched Sophie. The Peter she had known was always so concerned with maintaining an image of controlled perfection. They walked slowly along paths bordered by flowering horse chestnuts, a respectful distance between them, like two people getting acquainted. "I was surprised to learn you were cycling," admitted Sophie. Peter smiled. "I'm trying many new things lately. Cycling, cooking, with mixed results, I must admit. Meditation." He broke off, as if embarrassed by these confidences. "Meditation? Really?" Sophie couldn't hide her surprise. "It was the idea of a colleague at the Art Academy. He claims it helps to see the world differently, to be more present in the moment." Peter shrugged. "I don't know if it works, but I'm trying." This image of Peter sitting in lotus position, attempting to calm his always bubbling mind, drew a smile from Sophie. "I would have liked to see that. It's not very elegant," he admitted with a laugh. Then, more seriously, "But it's honest. I'm trying to be more honest, with others and with myself." They sat on a bench facing the lake, observing the children playing, lovers embracing, elderly people reading peacefully. "And you?" asked Peter after a moment of comfortable silence. "How is your life in Vermont?" Sophie told him about her daily life at the estate, her artistic explorations, the villages discovered, nascent friendships with local artists. She spoke animatedly of her New York exhibition project, of new techniques she was exploring. Peter listened with total attention, asking pertinent questions that showed genuine interest, not in the surface of her life, but in its substance. "You seem happy," he finally observed. "Truly happy. It shows in your eyes, in your way of speaking." Sophie reflected on this observation. "I am, I think, not in an euphoric or perfect way, but I feel aligned, as if for the first time my actions and my deep desires were going in the same direction." Peter nodded, understanding. "That's precious and rare." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. The sun was gently declining, lengthening the shadows of trees on the gravel paths. "Sophie," Peter finally said, turning his body slightly toward her, "I'm happy you came, but I wonder—" "Why?" The question was direct, straightforward. Another novelty in this man who had always handled insinuations and unspoken words with consummate skill. Sophie took a deep breath. "To be honest, I'm not entirely sure myself." She carefully chose her words. "In New York, when you mentioned the possibility that we might know each other anew, differently, something in me resonated. Then, when I heard about your accident, I felt the need to come see for myself. Not out of duty or pity," she quickly added, "but out of curiosity, perhaps, to see if what I glimpsed in New York was real." Peter welcomed this confession with a thoughtful nod. "And what have you discovered?" Sophie smiled, appreciating his frankness. "I'm discovering a man I didn't really know, someone more authentic, more vulnerable too." She looked him straight in the eyes. "Someone I might like to know better." Peter's face lit up with a hope he visibly tried to contain. "I would like that very much. But," Sophie continued, feeling the importance of clarifying her boundaries, "I'm not ready to give up my freedom, the life I'm building. I don't want to go backward." "I would never ask you to," Peter assured with fervor. "What you've created, your art, your independence, is precious. It would be a tragedy to compromise it." He hesitated before adding, "If we are to explore this possibility between us, it must be on new terms, equal, transparent, without preconceived expectations." This proposal resonated with the reflections Sophie herself had nurtured over recent weeks, not to erase the past, but to build something new from their experiences and the lessons they had drawn from them. "I'm returning to Vermont the day after tomorrow," she said, "but I'll be back in New York in September to prepare for the exhibition. Until then we could write to each other," suggested Peter. "Not like before, not surface courtesies or played roles, real letters, getting to know each other without pressure, without haste." Sophie smiled, touched by this proposal that respected her need for space while maintaining a connection. "I would like that very much." They remained seated side by side until the sun began to disappear behind the trees, sometimes talking, other times simply savoring the shared silence. It was a new territory for them both. Neither the illusory fairy tale of their beginning nor the distant coldness of their end, but something more nuanced, more authentic. When they finally parted at the park entrance, Peter gently took her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for this second chance I perhaps don't deserve, but will cherish." Sophie squeezed his hand slightly before releasing it. "Perhaps we both deserve it, not as a repair of the past, but as a possibility for the future." Returning to her hotel through the animated streets of the village, Sophie felt a new lightness within herself. She didn't know where this path would lead her, perhaps to a deep friendship with Peter, perhaps to a renewed love, or perhaps simply to a peaceful resolution of their shared story. But for the first time, uncertainty didn't frighten her. She welcomed it like a blank canvas, full of possibilities, waiting for her to apply her own colors, according to her own choices. September clothed New York in a golden light, transforming the Hudson into a ribbon of liquid gold, softening the contours of Manhattan skyscrapers. Sophie contemplated this spectacle from the window of her new apartment, a small, bright two-room place in Greenwich Village that she had rented for 6 months. The decision to settle temporarily in New York had come naturally over the months. The Metamorphoses exhibition required her presence, but even more, she had felt the need to close certain chapters of her life before opening new ones. The letters exchanged with Peter during the summer had woven between them a different bond, deeper, more authentic than what they had known during their marriage. They had revealed themselves to each other, without the social facades or family expectations that had previously shaped their relationship. Peter had told her about his childhood under the crushing weight of Davis traditions, his aborted rebellion at university, then his gradual capitulation to Elizabeth's demands. Sophie had confided her artistic doubts, her long-repressed dreams, her complicated relationship with parents who loved her but didn't truly understand her. Through these written confidences, they had discovered unexpected parallels in their journeys. Two people who had long lived according to others' expectations before finding their own path. That morning, Sophie was putting the final touches on preparations for the exhibition opening that evening. 20 carefully selected canvases narrated her artistic and personal evolution over recent months. The Awakening series formed its heart, but other works created in Vermont and New York completed this visual narrative. A discreet knock at the door interrupted her reflections. Claire, the gallerist, entered with the energy that characterized her. "Everything is ready," she announced, visibly satisfied. "The invitations have been sent, the press will be there, the labels are in place." She broke off upon noticing Sophie's pensive expression. "Nervous?" Sophie smiled. "Strangely, no. Rather contemplative. It's not just an art exhibition opening tonight, it's a page of my life." Claire nodded, understanding the importance of the moment. "Openings are always moments of transition." She glanced at her watch. "I must run to supervise the caterer. See you tonight, Sophie. It's your moment. Savor it." Left alone, Sophie prepared with care for this crucial evening. She chose a simple but elegant dress, a deep blue that recalled the Atlantic. Around her neck, a fine silver chain bearing a pendant in the shape of an open window, a gift from Frank, who had unfortunately had to forego the trip due to fragile health, but who would be present in spirit, as he had assured. Arriving at the gallery an hour before opening, Sophie took time to walk through the space, absorbing the atmosphere, observing how her works dialogued with each other under the carefully studied lighting. It was strange to see such intimate pieces of her soul thus exposed, but also deeply liberating. At 7 o'clock sharp, the first people began to arrive. Art critics, collectors, enlightened amateurs, but also students from the Academy of Art, invited by Peter, she realized with emotion. And then he was there, standing discreetly at the entrance. Peter had changed since their meeting in Central Park. Slimmer, his features more relaxed, he emanated a serenity she had never known in him. He approached her, holding a simple bouquet of poppies, those fragile and ephemeral flowers that had always been her favorites, a detail she had mentioned in one of her letters and that he had remembered. "These flowers don't rival your art," he said, offering them to her, "but they make me think of you, vibrant, authentic, resilient." Sophie accepted the bouquet with a moved smile. "Thank you for coming. I wouldn't have missed it for anything in the world." His gaze swept the gallery. "It's magnificent, Sophie, truly extraordinary." They were interrupted by Claire coming to introduce Sophie to an important collector. The evening unfolded in a whirlwind of conversations, congratulations, technical discussions about her artistic approach. Sophie navigated this world with an ease that would have surprised her a few months earlier, aware of the journey traveled from the timid young woman who let herself be guided by others' expectations. Toward the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin, an unexpected visitor made her appearance. Elizabeth Davis, elegant as always but visibly less assured in this informal artistic context, approached Sophie. "Good evening, Sophie," she said with formal politeness. "Congratulations on this remarkable exhibition." Sophie welcomed her presence with a serenity that surprised herself. The time for anger or resentment had passed. "Thank you for coming, Elizabeth." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, charged with the weight of their shared history. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, carefully choosing her words. "I wanted to see you, to see the person you've become. Peter speaks of you with such admiration." She paused, visibly searching how to express unfamiliar feelings. "I believe I owe you apologies for how I treated you." This admission, visibly difficult for such a proud woman as Elizabeth, touched Sophie more than she would have thought possible. "We all played roles that weren't truly ours," she responded gently. "The important thing is that we finally find our authentic path." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze lingering on one of the paintings, the one representing the mansion window, viewed from inside. "It's strange to see our home through your eyes. So beautiful, yet so imprisoning." She turned again to Sophie. "I'm beginning to understand why you had to leave." This recognition, however minimal, represented a significant step for Elizabeth. Sophie accepted it as such, without expecting more. The gallery emptied progressively, finally leaving only Claire, Sophie, and Peter. The gallerist, sensing they needed a moment of privacy, excused herself to finalize some details in her office. Peter and Sophie found themselves alone amid the paintings, silent witnesses to this metamorphosis they had both lived, separately yet in parallel. "I'm proud of you," said Peter simply. "Not as a husband or ex-husband might be, but as someone who has witnessed your journey and measures its full breadth." Sophie smiled, touched by these words that perfectly summarized the new nature of their relationship. "I'm proud of us both," she responded, "for having had the courage to face the truth even when it was painful, for having given ourselves the chance to grow, even separately." Peter approached her, reducing the physical distance that had separated them all evening. "And now?" he asked softly. "Where does this journey go?" It was the question that had been floating between them for months, never directly asked in their letters, but always present in filigree. Sophie took her time to answer, aware of this moment's importance. "I won't go backward," she finally said. The young woman who sought others' approval, who dreamed of a romantic fairy tale without knowing herself, she no longer exists. Peter nodded, accepting this essential truth. "But that doesn't mean we can't move forward," she continued, her gaze immersed in his. "Together perhaps, but differently. As two whole people who choose each other knowingly, without illusions, without inappropriate expectations." A glimmer of hope illuminated Peter's face. "I would very much like to explore that possibility." Sophie smiled, feeling in her deepest self that this time their connection was founded on something true, not on family arrangements or romantic fantasies, but on a mutual recognition of their respective truths. "Let's start simply," she suggested. "A dinner after the exhibition, walks through New York, honest conversations. Let's see where it leads us without haste." Peter extended his hand to her, not to seize or guide her, but as an invitation she was free to accept or not. Step by step, Sophie placed her hand in his, appreciating the warmth of this simple contact, the symbol of a renewed connection without the chains of the past. They left the gallery together, walking side by side through the New York streets, bathed in the soft light of street lamps. The city seemed different that evening, no longer a place of painful memories, but a space of new possibilities. Sophie didn't know exactly where this path would lead them, whether she and Peter would build together a love different from what they had known, or whether their roads would end up parting again. But for the first time in her life, this uncertainty didn't frighten her, for she had learned the most precious lesson. Happiness did not reside in the illusory security of a destiny already traced, but in the courage to write one's own story, day after day, choice after choice, with authenticity and awareness. As they turned a street corner, The New York sky opened above them, studded with stars despite the city lights. Sophie raised her eyes to this immensity, feeling in her deepest self this simple yet so difficult truth to grasp. Life is not a finished painting, but a canvas in perpetual creation, where each brushstroke, even mistakes, even revisions, contributes to the beauty of the whole. "Look at the stars," she murmured to Peter, "how they shine despite the darkness. Perhaps it's precisely the darkness that makes them shine." Peter followed her gaze to the sky, understanding the metaphor. Like our own shadows, which ultimately allowed us to find our light. They continued their path into the New York night, two souls transformed by their trials, advancing no longer toward an illusory ideal, but toward an imperfect reality, and precisely for that reason, authentically beautiful.